In Carcharodons Outer Dark, Robbie MacNiven places a scene near the beginning of the novel that should have ended the debate permanently. A Magos Primary of the Adeptus Mechanicus named Otte Benedikt has spent 3 centuries conducting exchanges with the Carcharodons Astra. He knows their protocols. He has met their Harvester Primes, their Techmarines, their Shoal Masters. He has catalogued their wargear and tracked their fleet movements. In 300 years overseeing these negotiations, he has encountered more Carcharodons warriors than almost any other living servant of the Omnissiah. He is, by any reasonable measure, the Imperium's foremost living expert on the operational habits of this chapter. The novel opens with Otte approaching a meeting point on a dust-swept void world. 12 Carcharodons warriors standing at the head of a valley, a jagged black crevasse at their backs. 6 in Tactical Dreadnought Armor on the flanks, their off-white ceramite caked with the planet's pervasive gray dust. 4 in Standard Battleplate and blue psyker-plate, marking the chapter's sanctioned Librarians. A 5th in red ceramite, bearing the Machina Opus of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a Techmarine. MacNiven builds the scene through Otte's augmented optics, each figure catalogued and registered, the tech priest's cognition processing the encounter with machine efficiency. Then he takes in the final figure. MacNiven writes it this way: even by the standards of the Adeptus Astartes, the figure was a giant, standing a head above the rest. He too was clad in Tactical Dreadnought Armor, and for a moment, Otte's analytics glitched, informing him he was looking at a graven statue. A slight shift in the giant's stance removed that possibility. Dust cascaded from the cliff-like plates of his immense suit and his huge, wickedly barbed gauntlets. Every inch of the warrior was clad and armed with the most hallowed and rare pieces of wargear Otte had ever set his optics upon. It made the Space Marines standing in the giant's shadow seem like children. Then MacNiven adds one more line, 5 words that carry more weight than any number of descriptors. He wasn't supposed to be here. A tech priest, a being who has replaced most of his biological nervous system with cogitators, whose emotional responses are continuously overridden by machine logic, who processes tactical data at speeds no unaugmented human can follow. This being registers, in MacNiven's exact text, almost 2 full seconds of binaric discord, pure cognitive failure, at the sight of one Space Marine. He misses a step. His colleague emergency cants him over their internal Vox channel to ask if there is a problem. 3 centuries of dealings with this chapter, and he has never seen this man. That isn't flavor text. That is a black library novelist writing in a canonical Carcharodons novel, describing a tech priest's augmented mind malfunctioning at the sight of one Space Marine. Otte has seen Space Marines for 300 years. He has protocols for them. His cognition knows how to handle them. Tyberos the Red Wake breaks the protocol at the machine level. A lot of you have been saying something is wrong here for years, that Tyberos doesn't add up, that the chapter doesn't fit any explanatory framework the Imperium provides. You were right. The canonical record, assembled as evidence rather than atmospheric background, doesn't describe a chapter master who happens to be large. It describes something the Imperium's official taxonomy can't accommodate. This is that case, and it runs on Tyberos specifically. The chapter is the context. He is the evidence. Every Space Marine chapter in the Imperium generates mandatory documentation, gene seed tithes, submitted every century to the Adeptus Mechanicus for verification of genetic purity. Founding records, registered with the Adeptus Terra, cross-referenced against the gene vaults used to create the chapter's initial stock. Primarch lineage, established through that same gene vault. Battle honors, catalogued and archived. These aren't optional. The entire framework that distinguishes a loyal chapter from a rogue force depends on them. The Codex Astartes, as written by Robbie Gilliman in the early 31st millennium, specifically decreed that each new chapter would tithe 5% of its genetic material to the Adeptus Terra and the Adeptus Mechanicus for testing and monitoring. This was the price of Guilliman's guarantee that no individual could ever again command the full might of a Space Marine Legion. The Index Astartes Compendium of 2020 states directly that the Carcharodons are technically of an unknown founding. Games Workshop's official designation for their Primarch lineage is a single word: unknown. The original Forge World rules for the chapter listed their gene seed progenitor as unknown, not unverified, not under review, unknown. They carry no officially recorded battle honors in any open Imperial archive. Imperial Armor, Volume 9 and 10. The Forge World documentation of the Badab War that constitutes the chapter's most detailed canonical treatment confirms that they feature nowhere within the open Imperial records. A chapter that has fought for the Imperium since at least the early 33rd millennium, the Mythos Angelica Mortis, written by the savant scribes of the Secretariat Militum of Terra sometime in M36, contains references to their activities dating back centuries further, has left no retrievable trace in the paper trail every other chapter generates automatically by existing. The oldest retrievable accounts of the Carcharodons visible to standard inquisitorial inquiry come from sealed records, not open archives. What the open record shows isn't their history, it's the shadow they leave by passing through Imperial space and occasionally appearing to fight someone's war. That is the institutional void. Before a single word is said about Tyberos' body, there is already something structurally wrong with the category this chapter occupies. A standard Space Marine is built on 19 genetic implants installed over years of surgical induction during a recruit's adolescence and young adulthood. The os medulla fuses and reinforces the skeleton, making bones harder than ceramite. The biscopia massively increases muscle mass and density across every major muscle group in the body. The oolytic kidney supplements liver function to enable metabolic processing of poisons and toxins. The neuroglottis gives the Astartes a hypersensitive sense of taste, capable of identifying chemical compounds. 16 more besides, each one a separate surgical procedure, each one building on the biological foundation of the previous. The process takes years because the body can't survive it faster. The result, the completed firstborn Astartes, stands approximately 7 to 8 feet tall out of armor. In power armor, taller. In tactical dreadnought plate, Terminator armor, the figure balloons to something larger still. The bulk of the suit's servo bundles and reinforced ceramite adding considerable height and mass to the wearer. These aren't estimates. These are the parameters of what the Imperium officially classifies as a Space Marine. Primarchs are the template the entire process is derived from. 20 engineered demigods created by the Emperor in the late 30th millennium, each one grown from a gene design unique to that individual. Where a completed Astartes reaches 7 to 8 feet of transhuman biology, a Primarch runs to 10, 11, 12. Rabute Guilliman's resurrection body, one of the better documented cases, towers over the Astartes who fought alongside him during the Ultramar campaign. The Primarchs weren't large Space Marines. They were a categorically distinct class of organism that Space Marines were engineered to approximate. Tyberos sits between those categories in every canonical physical description the books provide. Imperial Armor Volume 10, the Forge World documentation of the Badab War, establishes the physical baseline from direct observation during the conflict. Tyberos' Tactical Dreadnought Armor is described as having been heavily modified to suit his stature. That phrase is carrying enormous weight. Standard Terminator armor isn't a general-purpose suit made to fit a range of body types. Every piece is precision-engineered to specific tolerances, its servo bundles calibrated to the muscle mass and bone structure of the Astartes wearing it. The motive systems are matched to the wearer's dimensions. Dozens of individually fitted components must align with the wearer's skeleton and musculature to function correctly. When Imperial Armor Volume 10 states that Tyberos' suit required heavy modification, It's confirming that his body does not fit within the parameters Terminator armor was built to accommodate. The armor had to be rebuilt around him. Brass bonding studs fastening additional slab plates of gray ceramite over expanded blocks of plasteel, reinforced with rods of adamantium, every modification a visible monument to the physical problem the armorers were solving. Carcharodons. Outer Dark then places him in that modified suit next to his Terminator-clad honor guard and describes him standing a full head above them. His honor guard are already in Terminator plate. They are already significantly larger than a standard power armor-clad Astartes, and Tyberos is still a head above them. MacNiven describes the effect on Magos Otte with a precision that matters. The Space Marines standing in Tyberos' shadow appear to him as children. This is a 3-century veteran of negotiations, with one of the most physically formidable chapters in the Imperium. A being whose organic emotional responses have been extensively suppressed and replaced with machine cognition, describing the comparative visual effect of standing near Tyberos as being near something in a fundamentally different physical category than the warriors around him. MacNiven isn't writing about a tall space marine. He's writing about something the Magos' own augmented pattern recognition struggles to classify. His face, when revealed from the helm, is a corpse-white nightmare, with half the bones of his skull exposed in what the novel describes as a bloodless grimace, and eyes the text calls a soulless, depthless black. He communicates with the other Loyalist commanders during the Badab War only in a soft whisper that Imperial Armor Volume 10's exact phrasing always carried the promise of certain death. He is never seen outside his modified Terminator plate. When he moves through combat in Outer Dark, MacNiven describes his physical weight cracking open the carapace of enemies as he passes through them. Not his weapons, his mass. The Wargamer, in coverage of his tabletop rules, describes Tyberos as among the largest firstborn Astartes, the non-Primaris, unenhanced by call generation, in documented 40K canon. The books don't give him a measurement in feet. They don't need to. They give you the Magos' cognitive failure, the armor modification requirement, the honor guard comparison, and the children framing. The audience is expected to draw the obvious conclusion from those data points. The thing that makes Terminator-clad Space Marines look like children occupies one recognized category in the Imperial record. Tyberos isn't officially listed in that category. The weapons are the second exhibit and the strongest single artifact in the case. Hunger and Slake are twin relic gauntlets. Each weapon functions simultaneously as a power fist, a lightning claw, and a chain fist. 3 separate specialist weapon categories combined into a single implement. Imperial Armor Volume 10 describes them as combining barbed power blades with an inner maw lined with vicious teeth. In Outer Dark, they are described as ancient power fists, combining wicked power talons with twin-linked underbite chain blades. The visual is coherent. Gauntlets that grip and crush at power fist scale while deploying bladed talons and a mechanized chain maw simultaneously. They are, by the functional descriptions across the canonical Forge World publications, more complex and more multifunctional than any single standard weapon type in the Astartes arsenal. The canonical verdict on their origin appears in the Imperial Armor Volume 10 entry for Tyberos, citing the Forge World Rules release. Hunger and Slake are of a pattern and manufacture unknown to the Adepts of Mars. Unknown to the Adepts of Mars. The Adeptus Mechanicus is the institution that remembers everything the Imperium has ever manufactured. Standard template constructs, the STC system, represents 10,000 years of weapons development, catalogued, cross-referenced, and maintained on Mars and in Forge World archives across the galaxy. Every mark of Power Fist ever produced for the Adeptus Astartes, every Lightning Claw configuration, every Chain Fist pattern from the Great Crusade era through the present day, metallurgical composition, circuit architecture, motive force design, manufacturing origin, all catalogued. The Mechanicus' greatest obsession is finding new STC fragments, because new STC fragments represent technology they don't already have classified. When they encounter hunger and slake, they come up empty. These weapons don't appear in the catalog. The people who remember everything can't tell you who made them, when, or from what template. Tyberos didn't emerge from any founding carrying these weapons. He won them. The canonical account, recorded in the Fandom Tyberos wiki entry, citing Outer Dark directly, describes a bartering negotiation between the Carcharodons and the Ashen Claws, the renegade Black Shield warband operating in the Outer Void, during which Tyberos was provoked into single combat with the Ashen Claws chapter master, Nihat Nev. Tyberos won. He claimed hunger and slake as the prize. Nihat Nev still seethes at the loss and continues to provoke the Carcharodons' ire whenever their paths cross. That provenance chain matters because of where it leads. The chapter Whisper, the internal mythology of the Carcharodons, presented in Outer Dark as legend rather than confirmed history, holds that hunger and slake once belonged to the Ravenguard Legion's 18th chapter, the Terran formation exiled to the Outer Dark by Primarch Corax himself after he assumed command of the 19th Legion. The Terran-born Ravenguard weren't trusted by Corax. They had formed under different leadership and held different loyalties to the Primarch who arrived to lead them. Corax purged them from the main legion and sent the 18th chapter into the Ghoul Stars to bring the light of the Emperor to a region of space most Imperial commanders preferred not to think about. That formation eventually became the renegade Black Shield force known as the Ashen Claws, who survived the heresy, survived the Scouring, and survived 10,000 years in the Outer Void, somehow maintaining enough coherence to still deal with the Carcharodons through trading negotiations in the present day. The Whisper is framed as mythology, but the Ashen Claws are canonical. Their Ravenguard origin is canonical. Corax's exile of the Terran-born elements of the 19th Legion is canonical. If hunger and slake passed through that chain of custody, Great Crusade-era Ravenguard manufacture, exile to the Ghoul Stars, 10,000 years of void operation through the Ashen Claws, transfer to Nihat Nev, lost to Tyberos in single combat, then these weapons are pre-heresy artifacts, over 10,000 years old, and still unidentifiable by an institution with 10,000 years of comprehensive manufacturing records. The tech priests of Mars have had 10 millennia to catalog every piece of Astartes wargear. They look at Tyberos' primary weapons and produce no classification. Either hunger and slake were manufactured outside the STC system entirely, or they were manufactured before the system could record them, or they were manufactured from a template that was deliberately removed from the record. All three possibilities point in the same direction. During the Badab War, Tyberos submitted to psychic probing and gene sampling by the Inquisitor Legate responsible for the campaign. Imperial Armor, Volume 10, records this explicitly. He volunteered the examination, offered it as the price of his chapter's participation, and the Inquisitor Legate vouched for him based on the results. Lord Commander Carib Kuln of the Red Scorpions accepted the Carcharodons into the Loyalist line of battle. Whatever the anomaly surrounding Tyberos is, it didn't register as a biological threat on standard Imperial assessment. That is a fact. It also does not make the physical descriptions disappear or the weapons become classifiable. The chapter's institutional position compounds the individual anomalies into something that requires a structural explanation. Post-Badab War documentation confirms that the Carcharodons received all rights of red and gray tithe affirmed in recognition of their service, meaning gene seed tithes are active. Tithes are submitted. The question is what those submitted tithes reveal. If the gene seed were clean Ravenguard stock, the progenitor wouldn't be listed as unknown across multiple Forge World publications. If the founding were registerable through standard procedures, it would be findable. The original Forge World rules, which constituted the first detailed canonical treatment of the chapter, listed their progenitor as unknown, despite tithing records being active. Tithes submitted results unclassifiable. That isn't administrative oversight. That is a gene seed producing data the standard Mechanicus classification system doesn't have a category for. A chapter whose ties return no legible progenitor designation exists in a specific administrative condition. It has satisfied the procedural requirement of submission, while the contents of that submission reveal nothing the Imperium already knows how to interpret. Combined with no battle honors in the open archive, no accessible founding date, and an official GW Primarch designation of unknown, this is an institutional void constructed with precision. The chapter isn't poorly documented through entropy. A chapter founded in any numbered founding would have founding documentation that survived even incomplete. A chapter with Ravengard gene seed would have gene tithe returns that identified Ravengard genetic markers through standard testing. The documentation that should exist does not. The gene tithe results that should be legible aren't. Both of these conditions exist simultaneously and persistently across 10 millennia of operations. The Day of Exile is the chapter's own account of their origin moment. Their oral tradition preserves it. The wandering ancestors were banished from their homeworld and ordered beyond the galaxy's edge at the behest of an individual the chapter calls the Void Father. The Mythos Angelica Mortis, an imperial document written by the Secretariat Militum of Terra around M36, drawing on a far older lost source that predates even that, describes them as having been dispatched into the outer darkness upon that first day of exile, there to ravage the foes of mankind until their final atonement. Dispatched, passive voice, an action done to the Carcharodons by an external authority. They were sent. The language of the Mythos Angelica Mortis does not describe a chapter that chose the outer void. It describes a chapter that was placed there. Their exile isn't open-ended. The chapter's mythology holds that only with the coming of Temata Ngaro, the Forgotten One, can the edicts of exile be overturned and the eternal crusade in the darkness be brought to a close. Temata Ngaro is identified in canonical Carcharodons lore as Arcus Fall, a Ravengard commander from the Great Crusade era, the only other individual in recorded imperial history who has held the title Shade Lord, the Carcharodons' designation for their chapter master, the same title Tyberos holds in the present day. The exile terminates when a specific figure returns. That isn't how permanent exile works. Permanent exile has no return condition. This exile has been given a defined endpoint, a condition for lifting, which implies someone built the condition in along with the exile itself. The Imperium does not construct conditions for return on things it intends to never use again. It constructs conditions for return on assets it intends to redeploy when circumstances allow. The strongest objection to the entire theory deserves full engagement, because dismissing it without proper treatment is intellectually dishonest, and this audience knows the argument well enough to notice. Primarchs aren't simply large, genetically enhanced humans. They are something categorically different. Warp entities stuffed into physical shells, created with significant psychic presence as a fundamental aspect of their nature. The Emperor built them with warp expression as a feature. Every Primarch has a distinct relationship to the warp that defines their capabilities, their weaknesses, and the particular character of the gene seed they pass to their legions. A null, a blank, a pariah, a person who carries the pariah gene, is the structural opposite. A null does not simply lack psychic power. A null is an absence in the warp's fabric, a hole in the psychic weave of the universe, a being who does not register in the warp at all. These two properties are, by most understandings of the setting, fundamentally incompatible. Building a warp entity with null traits is like engineering an object to simultaneously exist and not exist in the same dimensional space. The Horus Heresy Forge World material, specifically Book 7 dealing with the Sisters of Silence and the Pariah gene, gets close to this directly. It notes that no Space Marine or Custodian Guard has ever been recorded as a psychic null, and it offers an explanation. The Emperor's own genetic material, which underlies all Space Marine gene seed via the Primarch lineage, carries what the scholars speculate might be a sliver of the Emperor's own psychic power, and that this element would be wholly an anathema to the pariah gene and likely simply kill its implanted subject. This is why there are no blank Astartes. This is why the Sisters of Silence aren't Space Marines. The gene seed and the pariah gene can't coexist without the recipient's death. This is a serious argument, and it's the right objection to make. Two things can be said in direct response, and only two are needed. First, no GW canonical source explicitly states that a Primarch can't carry or express the pariah gene. The Forge World Book 7 speculation is offered by in-universe scholars reasoning about standard Astartes. It does not address whether the Emperor, who engineered the Primarchs not from standard gene seed templates, but from individual gene designs, each constructed from scratch, could have built one to interact with the pariah gene differently than standard Astartes do. The Primarchs weren't created through the Gene Vault system. They weren't derived from existing templates. The Emperor built 20 separate organisms, each with unique biology. Whether he could engineer one to express null traits without the incompatibility that kills standard Astartes aspirants is a question canonical GW material has never addressed, because canonical GW material has never confirmed or denied the existence of a null Primarch. Second, the Emperor didn't encounter the pariah gene and decide it was strategically useless. He weaponized it extensively and deliberately. The Sisters of Silence, female nulls, organized, uniformed, armed, and deployed by Imperial design as anti-psyker shock troops at the height of the Horus Heresy, are the clearest expression of this. The Colexis assassin clad exists because the Officio Assassinorum, under the Emperor's direction, found a way to turn the null aura into a precision tactical instrument capable of killing psykers with their own reflected power. The Emperor banned independent research into the pariah gene while maintaining his own sanctioned experimental programs. He understood the gene deeply enough to categorize it, restrict it, channel it, and field it at scale across multiple institutional expressions. The question of whether an organism engineered from first principles by that same Emperor, not a naturally occurring blank, but a purpose-built, gene-designed being, could express null traits without killing itself, isn't answered by pointing to the standard Astartes incompatibility. Standard Astartes weren't engineered from first principles. Primarchs were. Even setting all of that entirely aside, even if the null Primarch is genuinely impossible by the strictest reading of the biology, Tyberos still requires an explanation. The physical anomalies recorded in Imperial Armor Volume 10 and Carcharodons Outer Dark don't disappear because the metaphysical objection is difficult. A chapter master whose Terminator plate required structural modification to contain him, who stands a full head above his Terminator-clad honor guard and modified plate, whose weapons the entire Adeptus Mechanicus can't classify, who commands a chapter with 10,000 years of operations and no legible paper trail, who caused a 3-century veteran tech priest's augmented cognition to malfunction at first sight. That person still needs an account of what he is. The objection answers the theoretical question. It does not answer the observable one. The structural parallel that reframes the observable picture is the Grey Knights, and the Grey Knights make the entire framework legible. During the Horus Heresy, specifically in its final stages as Horus was already approaching Terra, Malcador the Sigillite traveled the Imperium selecting candidates for a project he was personally directing. He found 12 worthy individuals, 4 lords and administrators who would become the founders of the Inquisition, and 8 Space Marines drawn from both loyal and traitor legions who had personally remained loyal regardless of where their Primarchs fell. Nathaniel Garrow, survivor of the Eisenstein incident, Garviel Loken, Tylos Rubio, Macer Varen, others. Men whose loyalty to the Emperor had been tested and confirmed under the worst possible conditions. Malcador brought the 8 Space Marines to Titan, Saturn's moon, where a fortress monastery had already been prepared, fully stocked with gene seed, armaments, recruits gathered in secret from across the galaxy, and everything necessary to create a new army of Space Marines. He then hid Titan inside the warp itself, using macro Geller fields and sigillic rites, removing it from real space entirely for the duration of the Siege of Terra. When Titan re-emerged during the Second Founding, having spent an indeterminate period inside the warp where time passes differently, those 8 warriors had become a full chapter of 1,000 trained battle brothers. They were secretly registered as Chapter 666 in the Second Founding lists, despite fewer than 400 chapters being commissioned at the time. They were embedded within the Inquisition as the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Malleus, the arm dedicated to fighting demonic incursion. For centuries after their founding, only the Inquisition and the chapter masters themselves knew the Grey Knights existed. Space Marines who encountered them had their memories psychically scoured. Imperial Guard regiments who fought alongside them were executed to prevent the information from spreading. A dying inquisitor named Kirill Cinderman, one of the 4 lords Malcador had selected, the last survivor of that founding group, revealed the chapter's existence during the War of the Beast, over 1,500 years after the Horus Heresy, because he was physically the last man alive who knew. The Emperor foresaw that the heresy would leave him unable to actively defend humanity from chaos, so he tasked Malcador with building an institutional answer to that incapacity. The Grey Knights were created, as the Lexicanum states, citing canonical sources directly, to serve as humanity's greatest weapon against the forces of chaos. Their gene seed does not come from a Primarch's gene vault. It was taken from the Emperor directly. Their founding inscription on the Arcus Daemonica reads, "One unbreakable shield against the coming darkness, one last blade forged in defiance of fate. Let them be my legacy to the galaxy I conquered, and my final gift to the species I failed." In over 10,000 years of service, not one Grey Knight has ever fallen to chaos. The Grey Knights are maximally psychic. Every battle brother is a psyker. Their armor is inscribed with wards against warp corruption. They fight chaos by meeting it on its own terrain, the warp, with the most powerful psychic force the Emperor could assemble from outside his own Primarch lineage. They exist to fight the thing that can't be fought with conventional military power. A strategic thinker who builds a chapter of maximum psychic power to fight one existential threat isn't thinking about that one threat in isolation. He is thinking about the complete threat environment. The strategic complement to maximum psychic power is maximum null power. A force that does not exist in the warp is a force that chaos can't perceive through any means of warp-based divination. It can't be found through sorcery. It can't be targeted through psychic means. Warriors carrying null traits would operate in environments saturated with warp energy, where a chapter of powerful psychers becomes a liability, where the Grey Knights themselves, with their formidable psychic presence, are detected, targeted, and countered by the very entities they fight. The null force would be invisible to those entities by definition. It would be the weapon for the scenarios where psychic power is the wrong tool. One chapter of light, one chapter of absence. The Grey Knights against chaos in its declared wars. The null chapter against chaos in the places where chaos doesn't even know it's being fought. Malcador built the Grey Knights in secret during the Horus Heresy. The Emperor wrote the inscription calling them his legacy and his final gift. A man who thinks in legacies and final gifts, and who spent the Great Crusade preparing contingencies for scenarios he foresaw before anyone else did. That man does not build one secret chapter. He builds the complete instrument. The 2nd and 11th Primarchs were both expunged from all known Imperial records during the early 31st millennium. The Lexicanum, citing standard primary canonical sources, states that precious little is known about 2 of the 20 Space Marine legions, numbered 2 and 11, and their respective Primarchs. Their names aren't recorded in any accessible Imperial archive. Their heraldry has been removed. Their accomplishments were erased. Their legions ceased to exist as named units. What canonical HH material confirms is that the Emperor and Malcador both knew exactly what happened to both Primarchs. Their fate wasn't a mystery to the highest levels of Imperial authority, only to everyone else. In one account from the Horus Heresy novel series, when Horus attempted to speak the name of one of the lost brothers aloud, Malcador the Sigillite personally intervened to prevent it. Not an Inquisitor, not a Lord Commander, the man who built the Grey Knights and hid Titan in the warp, the second most powerful human in the Imperium, shut down the conversation himself. More recent canonical lore confirms that the Lost Legion's rank-and-file Marines weren't destroyed alongside their Primarchs. They were integrated into other legions. That is what the record shows, the census accounting for what happened to the surviving Marines after the expungement. But integrated into other legions is an administrative entry, not a complete inventory. It accounts for the bodies that were verifiably placed in specific chapter structures. It does not account for separations made before integration or for Marines removed under the same authority that was simultaneously building secret chapters from select individuals. Malcador's entire operating methodology during the Horus Heresy was selection. He traveled the galaxy, finding specific individuals for specific purposes, separating them from their existing formations, and placing them in institutions he was building in parallel with the main war effort. He did this for the Grey Knights. The question of whether he did it for any other purpose, using the window of maximum upheaval and record erasure that the expungement of 2 Primarchs and their legions represented, has no canonical answer, which is, in 40K, precisely where the most deliberate things tend to hide. The connection between the Carcharodons and the exiled Terran Raven Guard isn't fan inference. The Shade Lord title, Tyberos' designation as Chapter Master, appears in canonical Carcharodons lore as having been held by only one other individual in recorded Imperial history, Arcus Fall, an exiled Raven Guard commander who operated during the Great Crusade. The chapter whisper about Hunger and Slake places those weapons in a Terran Raven Guard formation exiled by Corax. The Forgotten One mythology describes Te Mata Naro, the figure whose return will lift the Edicts of Exile, in terms consistent with Arcus Fall's identity as the first Shade Lord. These aren't separate threads. They are the same thread. Terran-born Raven Guard, exiled by their Primarch. Weapons from that exile period. A title used only in that context. A chapter mythology built around waiting for that exile's designated end. The period when those Terran-born Raven Guard were being separated from the main legion is the same period when the 11th Legion's Marines were being integrated, or, alternatively, separated under different authority for different purposes. The overlap isn't confirmation. In 40K, confirmation of this kind of thing tends to arrive when GW decides to make money from it, not before. The overlap is a convergence of independent canonical data points, each generated by different sources and different authors, each pointing in the same direction. What can be confirmed? The Carcharodons claim 10,000 years of service to the Void Father. The Emperor and Malcador knew precisely what happened to the 11th Primarch. The Grey Knights were built in that same window of time, in secret, for a purpose that couldn't be publicly acknowledged, using gene seed from outside the Primarch system. The Nicor has sailed since the Horus Heresy. Tyberos carries weapons from before the Second Founding that the Adeptus Mechanicus can't classify. His armor required structural modification to accommodate a body that stands a head above his Terminator-clad honor guard. 3 centuries of the Imperium's foremost Carcharodon specialist had never seen him before the scene MacNiven wrote at the opening of Outer Dark. when Tyberos presented the Loyalist commanders at Badab War with his chapter's notices patent in 910.M41, he produced documentation signed by High Lords of Terra and Inquisitors who had been dead for centuries. Those documents were current. Their authorizations were still valid. Imperial Armor Volume 10 states this explicitly. The Inquisitor Legate accepted the credentials and vouched for the chapter. Multi-century paperwork that still opens Imperial doors isn't the record of a forgotten chapter. A forgotten chapter loses its credentials when the officials who issued them die. These credentials were built to outlast the officials who signed them. Lord Commander Carib Cullen of the Red Scorpions, the Magister Militant of the entire Loyalist force at Badab, accepted the Carcharodons into his battle line while stating in the Imperial Armor record that he was deeply concerned that their long voyage into the darkness of the outer void had led them to significantly deviate from the Codex Astartes. Significantly deviate. That phrase in the official documentation of a chapter Cullen had just cleared for Loyalist service. The concern was noted, recorded, and then set aside because the chapter's combat effectiveness was undeniable and their credentials were valid. After Badab, the chapter took their tides and their recruits and withdrew. The last sighting was an Explorator augury beacon tracking the Carcharodons' fleet as it tacked above the galactic plane and disappeared into the void. They have been out there since. The 2025 novel Carcharodons: Void Exile, the most recent canonical entry in the Black Library series, places them fighting alongside Adeptus Mechanicus forces at an isolated forge world against chaos threats, pulled back into the galaxy's operational sphere temporarily by the catastrophes of the current era, but still framed as warriors from beyond its edge. Still the Void chapter, still the hunters from the outer dark. The Terminus Decree sits in the Chamber of Purity on Titan under Grey Knight's custody. Ancient instructions written on parchment, sealed inside an artifact, maintained at Titan's highest security level. Its specific contents are classified above most Imperial access levels. What it means in full, what a mirror contingency from a mirror chapter might contain, is a separate investigation. What matters here is that it exists. The Emperor built sealed contingency plans and placed them inside the chapters he built in secret. He planned for outcomes so specific and so sensitive that those plans required physical custody by the same forces built to implement them. The Carcharodons aren't a chapter the Imperium forgot. A forgotten chapter still has history. Battles fought, planets defended, records scattered but recoverable. The Carcharodons have 10,000 years of operations that left almost nothing recoverable in any open Imperial archive. Their founding documentation isn't scattered, it's absent. Their gene tithe returns are active but unclassifiable. Their chapter master's body required the modification of armor built to the maximum tolerances of the Astartes frame. Their weapons don't appear in 10,000 years of comprehensive STC records. Their oral tradition remembers a day of exile and the Void Father who sent them into the dark. None of that is the product of negligence. It's the product of someone who understood how to build an institution that would still be functional 10,000 years after its architect was gone. The Emperor built the Grey Knights as humanity's greatest weapon against chaos. Maximum psychic power, total institutional secrecy, gene seed from his own line hidden for 1,000 years in Titan until the Imperium needed them. He left an inscription calling them his legacy and his final gift. He built the Colexis program. He built the Sisters of Silence. He weaponized the Null Aura across multiple institutional expressions simultaneously and banned anyone else from experimenting with it. Tyberos the Red Wake is what the complement to that architecture looks like at the chapter master level. A body that breaks the Astartes frame. Weapons the Adeptus Mechanicus can't classify after 10,000 years of trying. A chapter dispatched by the Void Father to wait in the outer dark under exile conditions that don't permit their return until a specific figure arrives. A complete absence from the open Imperial record that has been maintained without interruption for 10 millennia. 100 centuries of silence, of hunting in the dark between the stars, of recruiting from whatever populations the outer void yields, and submitting gene ties that return no legible result. The Imperium calls him a chapter master. The official designation says Primarch unknown. The evidence says something else. It says the Carcharodons are a weapon built by an emperor who thought in millennia, armed with something chaos can't touch, sent to the void to wait for circumstances that haven't yet fully arrived. It says Tyberos has been waiting longer than most chapter masters have been alive, carrying weapons no one can explain, commanding warriors no one can officially account for, in a chapter the open record can't recognize. Without consequences, no imperial institution is ready to process. He is the closest thing to a living Primarch the Imperium doesn't know it has. Sitting in the dark between the stars, exactly where the Void Father put him, waiting for Tamata and Garo to come home, and the edicts of exile to finally be overturned. They were dispatched into the outer darkness upon that first day of exile, there to ravage the foes of mankind until their final atonement. They hunt still. Subscribe for more lore built like this. The second Primarch debate gets its own case next. Drop which side you're on in the comments.